Brilliant. I'm going to do a quick introduction. Hello, everyone. My name's Kat. I'm part of the Beyond team. Beyond is a series of free training and learning opportunities, and particularly focused at organisations working in the early years space, financial services, sexual abuse and domestic violence, and mental health and wellbeing. We've been working with organisations for the past 6 to 8 months, really trying to understand what some of the critical and urgent needs are at the moment in responding to community needs as a result of COVID-19. And one of the key messages we heard time and time again was the need for an understanding and more confidence around how to deliver services safely online. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Ava and Ellie from the AVA Project, who are going to take us through the webinar today. In a moment, I'll pass you over to them, but I just wanted to say, first of all, a couple of quick words on accessibility. If you could go to the next slide, Ava. Thank you. So just wanted to share that we've tried to incorporate images with descriptions. We do have captions enabled, although it's a bit of a test today. So just to say that in the bottom of your screen, you should see a CC closed caption button. If you want to have captions while we're talking, you should be able to. If you can't, then our test isn't working. Let me know in the chat and I'll see what I can do. If we're unable to put them on, then we'll do so afterwards as we are recording this session. We tried to provide files in original format and to give clean and clear presentations, and hopefully we've got good video and audio quality. If at any time that drops, I will just pause the webinar to allow video and audio to catch up. So just a reminder once again, for those of you that have joined, if you could fill out the survey that I've just posted in the chat. This is the pre-survey where we just like to gather a little bit more about your understanding of the issue of safeguarding. And just a reminder that we are recording the session. We can't see you, but you can share, and I just posted it again, Paul. I'm just posting the survey link again. If you can't see it, we'll random. If you can't see it, I'll keep I'll keep trying to share it in the chat.
I don't know why, Kat. Sorry. If you've got so make sure you got to all panelists and attendees rather than just all panelists when you click on the two.
There we go. I just shared it to all panelists and attendees. Thank you, Ellie. I just wanted to confirm that we are recording. We can't see you. So if you want to share any messages or connect in the chat, please go ahead and do so. And we will be looking out for questions that are coming in as the webinar progresses. Thanks so much, and I'll pass over to Ava.
Hello, everyone. So welcome to this session of an introduction to digital safeguarding. So my name is Ava Kessner and I'm from an organisation called AVA. And as Kat said, if you have any kind of general comments or anything like that, please put them in the chat. If you have any direct questions, if you could put them in the Q&A and we'll deal with them at the end. So we're leaving sort of about 20 minutes at the end to do questions. So firstly, this session is going to cover the high level principles of digital safeguarding, what the difference between face-to-face safeguarding and safeguarding in a kind of digital online space, embedding digital safeguarding risk assessments in what you do and how you think about it, and then also looking at some of the things you need to think about while wanting to produce digital tools and online support. So things around kind of how it can be used for abuse, how specific things you need to think about when you're supporting vulnerable people, and lastly, how you think about it in terms of your staff well-being as well. So firstly, I'm going to ask all of you, if you could put it into the chat, that would be great. What do you think we're referring to when we talk about digital safeguarding? So what kind of tools or support systems or services do you think we're talking about? I'll give you a couple of minutes just to think about that and put that in the chat. So I'm seeing everyone put things in here. It's great. And I can totally see a lot of you are talking about online safety, GDPR, security and privacy. So that's great. So yeah, that's the kind of general framework that we're working in. And then, yeah, definitely. So it's also thinking about it. So what is digital safeguarding? So as we were all sort of saying in the chat at the moment, it's the ability for organizations to deliver services or support or use tools in a digital online space. And it's making sure that those tools and services are both safe, but also legal. And where we come from is that we also kind of add the concept of making sure that you're creating a trauma-informed space with anything that you design or create. So this is the first thing that I want to sort of start thinking about is when we talk about online safeguarding, we're talking about a variety of different mechanisms that you might be using to deliver your support. So as you can see here, I think a good way of thinking about it is about how you interact with those digital tools. So I've put this graph here to explain you've got how people, so that might be your users, your clients, anyone outside your organization, how they interact with it, but also how you as individuals within the organization, the staff interact with it. So you sort of start thinking of it in that way. So let's look through some of these different options. So firstly, you think about a website. So a website is a quite static form of information. So you produce copy, you put images on, all of that sort of stuff onto your website. So you have a lot of it, but then it kind of, you might update it now and again, but no one really interacts with it. So it's quite a static form of doing it, but you still need to make sure that it's safe and the content is correct. And then you think about something like email, and then you have both interactions one-to-one in a digital space. And all of these things are compromised in digital safeguarding. And so I'm going to go through a little bit more detail in all of that. I think the first one is thinking, you think about chat facilities here, and that is very much a two-way, quite instant form of communication. So again, that's quite different from email, isn't it? Because in an email, you've got time to think about, to respond. No one's actually expecting you to do it automatically. And then you think about message boards. And so you can have two different types of message boards. And again, so just thinking about how they work and how people interact with them. So you've got a moderated message boards where people might post things, and you have some control on that because you'll be moderating it, your staff will be moderating it. So you can make sure the content, who's listening to it and who's not. But then if you think of an unmoderated board, you might set it up and there might be some kind of code of conduct at the beginning and you say this is what it's for, but you're actually allowing people to interact it quite freely. So again, how they interact and what content and what comes up in it is more complicated. So again, the risks are quite different. So again, with this kind of space and digital safeguarding, it's about understanding the different tools you might be using and where the risks apply. So one of the things I would also say is digital safeguarding also refers to the physical hardware as well. So it's not just about kind of online tools, software, emails, or that. It also could be people's phones or their laptops, or also thinking about things like we call it the Internet of Things. So things like an Amazon Dot, or kind of a smart TV. So all of those things are compromised in that digital online space, and that's where we need to think about digital safeguarding. So be moving on now to thinking about what are the key principles of digital safeguarding. So I think the first thing is the digital safeguarding principles are exactly the same as face-to-face safeguarding. They're under the same sort of rules and regulations. However, they are different, and this is what we're kind of going to go through about how you think about the difference and how you think about the risks and thinking about the considerations you need to make that might be quite different than you'd be doing in an online space. So as you probably all know already, the key legislation around safeguarding is the CARE Act 2014. And this outlines 6 principles that you have to adhere to when doing safeguarding. So I'll quickly go through all of these for you. So the first one is thinking about empowerment. So you're supporting individuals to make their own decisions. Now, what we do for that quite a lot of the time is ensure that we kind of, when in the design process, when you're building how you're going to do services, when you're thinking about adapting services, is talking to the people that it affects. So we spend a lot of time speaking to what we call experts by experience, so people with lived experience, and see what would help them feel empowered. Then going on to protection. So again, this is about focusing on particularly making sure that vulnerable groups are safe and protected. This particularly refers to vulnerable adults that are outlined in the CARE Act, but also children. So again, you need to think about how you protect people, their data from risk in an online space. Next, we have prevention, which is again kind of doing the assessments before you go ahead with them so that you can mitigate the risk. What can you, if something has happened, what can you do to prevent it going forward? So that's really talking about that kind of mitigation. The next one is looking in partnership. So the partnership part of this is really, really important because it's about the idea of when you're doing safeguarding, one individual shouldn't be holding all the risk. So whether that's partnership within the organization, so, you know, different team, you have different leads and different teams, so you're sharing that risk, but also having partnerships with, for instance, your local authority leads and your safeguarding leads, or the police, or different multi-agencies in your area. So you know if an incident does happen, you know who to contact and who can be involved in assessing that risk and ensuring that person is safe. Accountability is actually a really important one when doing things in an online space, because you're a little bit more detached, so therefore it can be harder to kind of think about that accountability. But one of the things we say around this is that it's really important to be very like open and transparent about why you're doing things, what you're doing, and ensuring there's kind of a feedback loop, so that if there are any concerns that anyone has, they have the ability to let you know. And then the last one, which is really, really important, is the proportionality. When you're doing safeguarding, the risks can be very divergent. They can, you know, a same incident with a different person can result in different forms of risk of harm. And so what you have to keep in mind is what's proportional. You know, if something small happens, you don't want to kind of escalate that really quickly into kind of calling your local safeguarding lead, referring them, all of that. But in a different circumstance with a different person, it might be the appropriate action. So again, it's all about making sure that you think about safeguarding as quite a dynamic process, that you're not going, we'll do the same every time. You look at each situation as it comes. So when it comes to digital safeguarding, we highly recommend the resource by Girl Effect, which is here, which talks about the digital safeguarding. Sorry. Resource, and we'll be sending out our resource pack, which is also freely available on our website, which will have all the links and all the information, and has a lot more advice around this area, which is quite comprehensive stuff. So we'll be sending that at the end. But this particular pulling it out is looking at this diagram that they've put forward, which is a really good way of kind of conceptualizing what we mean by digital safeguarding. So firstly, the things around the outside. First one is the ethics point of view. So whenever you kind of do any work, you're bound by the principles and values of the organization you work for and an ethical framework. So again, this really, really will depend on where you're working, what kind of work you're doing, what organizations. So it might be things that, you know, and you have to kind of embed that into your digital practice as well. So it might be something like, you know, as an organization, you say that we're not going to share data with any third parties. That's an ethical decision. And so therefore you need to make sure that that's embedded throughout your work. And then safeguarding. So again, making sure you account to those three principles. And then you can make judgments on that. And then I'm going to go into a bit more detail in the two sections in the middle. So first, looking at digital security. So digital security is really highlighted around GDPR, and there's lots of guidance around this in the Information Commissioner's Office website, and again, we'll be sending links out. And this is really about making sure that whatever you keep data, any information that you keep in a digital space is securely held. So this is ensuring things that you have good virus protection, that you have passwords protected. And if it's particularly sensitive information, also looking at kind of making an extra step, maybe encrypting it, and all of that kind of process. So it's making sure that whatever you keep is secured carefully. And you would do that if you had sort of paper copies as well. But it's very important to do that in the digital space. And I think the first thing to also remember is that the laws and regulations around how you keep things safe really depend on where you're operating and where also the data is being held. And so this is something that I kind of want to explore a little bit, which is the fact that when you use third-party websites, it's really important that you look at the terms and conditions, especially around where they actually physically store their servers and data. So if any website operates within a European context, they're bound by GDPR laws. However, they're outside that, they might not have such good security around physical servers, so they could get hacked, things could happen to it. So again, it's really important that when you look at other kind of third-party platforms that you don't have as much control of that data, that you kind of look into where it's being held. And then, as the kind of pre-reading explains, the difference about data security, which is really, really important, is also about data privacy. Now, this is a bit more nuanced, and it's about consent. It's about how you use the data that you are collecting. So again, the key part of all of this is making sure that you're very clear and honest and transparent when when you're collecting data. So, you know, this is even if you're collecting cookies on your website, or whether you're collecting sort of attendance information, or could be incredibly private information if you're dealing with people's medical records or their history of abuse or anything like that. And you have to think about why are you collecting it and how are you processing it. And I think one of the key things here is that you might want to go ahead and do a data privacy impact assessment around all your projects and all your work. So what I would say about a data protection impact assessment is sometimes it is a legal requirement under GDPR when you do work, but it's not always necessary. However, it's highly recommended to look through all the risks and kind of one by one, and that kind of process really helps you doing it. So essentially with the GDPR, you're identifying the risk to an individual and how likely and severe the outcome of them doing that, and mitigating any risk. And it's one of the things that's really important in all of this is ensuring that you have consent to have all the data, but also that it's informed consent. So again, being very transparent about it, opt-in instead of opt-out is always highly recommended. And there's some additional considerations you need to have when thinking about this around children. As you all may know, that safeguarding legislation around children encompasses a bit more information, such as around the Children's Act 1989, Children and Family Act 2014, and Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018. Now, the key to this is that we all have a duty to ensure that children are safe, both emotionally and physical. And local authorities have very clear duties around this. So it's really, really important if you work with children, whether that's even if you're communicating with them or doing workshops with them, any kind of role around that, it's very important that you have clear and robust mechanisms that you can refer into the local authorities' systems. And again, when you're talking about digital safeguarding, it's transferring kind of what you would do face-to-face into a digital space. What I would say is that Article 8 of GDPR really kind of goes down into what information and how children can consent or not. So I highly recommend, if you work with children, to kind of look into this in a bit more detail. But the overview is that children under 13 are not allowed to consent in their own right to use digital tools. So they would need consent from an adult, a guardian, to be able to do that. There are some exceptions that are based on there's also some exceptions if you are doing things what's called in the best interest of the child, especially if you're running things like therapy programs or things like that. But again, I would highly recommend going on looking at the ICO website that has quite a lot of guidance in this, and it goes really in depth into it. And I think one of the things you have to remember is you have to make reasonable checks to check in the age of a child. So, you know, you think if you go onto certain websites where you think the content isn't suitable, having some ability to kind of do age checks is quite important. Okay. So kind of going into the differences between working online and face-to-faces and what the challenges and opportunities are here. And as I said before, the principles are very similar when you're talking about face-to-face safeguarding and digital safeguarding. However, how you think about the risks can differ widely. What I would say is there's some real opportunities in using digital and online tools to deliver support and services. And we're a real advocate of that. And what we think about this is the idea of digital safety is an enabler to help you manage those risks. And I know over the last 12 months, we've all had to do a massive shift. And lots of times we kind of think about digital work as not being quite as good as face-to-face, the second best option. And what I would say about that is that it really depends on the circumstances. And in some ways, actually online can be a real, really complementary to what work you would do face-to-face. So again, kind of when we're moving forward and we're all out of this in July, I think it's really important that you all kind of look at what you've done over the last 12 months. And if you have adapted your services, what parts of it I'd actually like to keep and integrate into your other services. So again, it's really important that you kind of keep that all in mind. So the first thing I think we're going to go through is what you need to be aware of when you do digital safeguarding and key ways that you can help kind of understand the risks to it. So I'm sure some of you are aware that when you work online, there's a bit of a detachment. Your name, your identity, your kind of avatar, you could be completely anonymous. And that actually makes people act slightly differently, and in some ways, a lot more open. And we call that the disinhibition effect. So again, people are loosen up, they're more likely, and one thing to keep in mind is they're more likely to disclose things quicker. And so it's really important that you're kind of all aware of that when you're delivering work online. But it can also mean that people can lead people to say abusive things, unkind things. We call that toxic disinhibition. And so therefore, you know, you think about how trolling works and things like that, that's really important to keep in mind. So again, it's how you make sure that people have a kind of idea of the conduct and what you're expecting of how they behave in that space. So what generally the disinhibition indicates an attempt to understand and explore oneself, to work through problems and find new ways of being. So in some ways it can be a good thing. And disinhibition especially happens when you don't feel like you can be seen. So again, thinking about message boards can make it, you know, when you're using social media where you can't be seen, or whether people put their cameras on and off in Zoom chats, or whether you're kind of doing things like this where we have webinars where we can't see your faces versus kind of more intimate meetings where everyone can be seen. So it's just thinking about the things and what might change that. And again, if you can't see anything, the other things that what we miss out on are some of the facial and body language clues that kind of can give you an idea of maybe things that are being unspoken. So again, there's lots of articles out there about this, but you just think about how everyone is slightly different when they speak online, whether, you know, when you have meetings and it's harder to kind of, the way you talk, it doesn't seem quite as natural. And also one of the things that we've noticed quite a lot of our time is a lot of our client group, people work with us, so their client group have got increasing body dysphoria for using video calls and Zoom. And that's possibly because they're constantly looking at their own image, you know, in the little boxes. And that can have a real effect to kind of the way people view something, and something that's very unnatural to most of us. I mean, you'd very rarely go to a meeting and stare in the mirror for an hour. So I think, you know, those things that you really need to think about. I would say that, you know, it's perfectly reasonable that some people might want their videos on and off in certain circumstances for various reasons. And I think what is just to be aware that that kind of changes that atmosphere and that kind of dynamic, and that you won't be able to pick up on bodies and cues. And so you just need to kind of build that into how you moderate things or how you kind of go about your planning so that you can take that into account. It's also really important to note that people have very, very different confidence with tech and digital tools, and that can make a real difference to how comfortable and safe they feel using them. So again, it's really important that you kind of consider that with whatever client group you might have. Do they need extra support? Do you need to put in additional time to get them feeling really comfortable with it before you kind of bring them into another space? So again, it's just building that into all of your planning processes. And on top of that, it's also really important to think that some people might have some really negative experiences of using tech and being in a digital space that can be quite traumatic. And so they will need additional support and reassurance. And again, one of the things that we say about this, the key thing there is to be really open and transparent. Tell them what security is in place, how you're sharing the data, here's the referral mechanism if you have any worries. So they can help them understand what to expect before they go into using anything. And this is important both if you're kind of delivering online kind of live, but also if you have tools that are kind of more static. So whether you've designed gaming tools or your websites or anything like that, it's important to think about, well, what experience people are going to have and what can you tell them about it so that everything feels quite natural and relaxed. And then there, of course, all of the other considerations that we'll go into a bit more detail, sort of things around mental health issues, disabilities and cultural differences, that you need to make sure that anything you kind of do in a digital space is as accessible as possible. And then lastly, the thing that has become quite important to think about, especially where we've all been locked in our houses over the last 12 months, is that blurring of the lines between a home space and a workspace, or where you're getting a service and your home, and all of that kind of blurs together can create additional problems that you need to think about. So one of the things that we say is that it's really important to be mindful of it, of what you're bringing into people's homes, how they may feel about it, whether their home was their safe space where everything else was outside. So how does it feel for them both before and after they've, let's say, had a video call for a service? So again, it's about making sure you build in things like check-ins, making sure they're reassured beforehand. And again, a check-in might be something that you decide that you do a few days later, a week later, in a different format. So again, it's just kind of giving them as much opportunity to think about their well-being and how they might be affected by the various tools they use. And this both affects sort of your external client group and people in contact, but also your staff. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that a lot of this also refers to how you work with people that are giving the service out as well, because a lot of these things are still very, very relevant for them. And that's why we always recommend build in clinical supervision with all your projects, so that staff have a time to do that reflective practice going forward. Oh, sorry. Whilst it seems like I've told you all the challenges, I want to now go into some of the opportunities of using digital to provide support and services. One of the things that we always say is that in some ways they can be a lot more accessible. This is because you can adapt them more easily for individual needs, cost, it can be low costs, a point of entry for people, and also that they are not so necessarily reliant on working hours. So you can have something that's out there for 24 hours a day, sort of information and support. It allows people to do things anonymously, so in their own time. And we think that there's some really good opportunities to create peer support spaces in this work. And a really good example of that is the Mix that uses different message boards on their platform to discuss mental health issues with young people. So again, there's a system where people can kind of go in over time and start chatting to each other and get support that way. But again, with all of these things, you just need to kind of think about the risks as you go through them. I think it's also a real opportunity to kind of give people additional skills when using kind of tech and digital spaces. And it's something that, you know, the world is full of these days. So again, it's kind of building that confidence up can be a really good opportunity as well. So whilst we've kind of discussed the kind of high level principles and the things you need to think about, I now want to kind of go into the kind of more nitty gritty, which is how you assess risks of digital tools. And when I say digital tools, I also mean digital support. So it doesn't matter how you kind of construct a project, it refers to all of these things. So the first thing you need to do is ask yourselves, what are the risks, both for the users and for yourselves as an organization and for your staff? And then what safeguarding needs to be put in place so that everyone feels confident in their service? So those are the first two questions, identifying the risks and then thinking about what needs to be put in place to make sure that kind of prevention part of it that we were talking about before. So these might be safety measures, systems, processes, what needs to be developed around that so that everyone feels comfortable and secure. And then the thing that you need to think about this is in three counts. So first of all is thinking about the content. So what is in it? Is it accurate? Is any of it harmful? Is any of it legal? And establishing clear rules for users and for your staff on what's appropriate and what's inappropriate in the context of it being important for everyone. And I think it's really important to note that, you know, this includes what you, for instance, what you statically put on your website or, you know, on your social media and things like that. So again, it's just kind of looking at the actual content and then kind of going back to what we were talking about before about the contact. So the risk here involves inappropriate or unwanted contact between two different users. So that could be a staff member and a client, it could be two staff members, it could be people in, if you're running peer support, in your peer support circle. And it's looking at ways that they could exploit each other. And so first of all, it's really important with all your staff and internally that you kind of go through the same process as you would when recruiting anyone that's doing frontline work, so looking at DBSs and ensuring all of that sort of stuff. But it's also something making sure that you're quite vigilant on it and that you have really clear mechanisms that people can report anything that they're worried about. So, you know, if you're running a forum, having a space at the bottom saying, report any issues here, and that gets alerted to your staff. So again, it's just thinking about those sort of things. How would someone contact them if they were concerned or worried about something? And then the last one to think about is conduct. So the risks relating to how people behave online, you know, whether it's thinking about bullying or trolling or people putting abusive comments on any kind of work you do. And I think what we say very clearly about that is just having as clear guidance as possible. Explain what would happen if it's being escalated and, you know, the same sort of reporting mechanisms with the contact side of it. You know, so things that we would say would be things like if you're running an online group, you know, having, before you start, having a session that says, this is how we're going to behave, this is how we're all going to listen to each other. So everybody's on the same page when they kind of walk into that process. And then lastly, we suggest that you develop a risk matrix. So, you know, a really simple spreadsheet in our resource pack, there's some good templates and examples of this. So looking at identifying what the risks are, making a judgment of how likely or unlikely they're going to happen. And then if they did happen, what is the risk, the severity of that risk? What kind of harms can happen to people? And then looking at measures, so the kind of prevention measures of how you reduce that risk. Sorry, I apologize. Don't know what's happening there. There we go. So I think the first thing we would say, as we mentioned before, is a DPA. So as we said, in some projects, there will be a legal requirement and in others, they're not, but it helps you look at kind of where the risks, especially around personal data are. So you kind of need to describe the scope, the context and the purpose of why you're collecting data, and do that at every step. And if at any moment you go, I'm not sure why we're doing it, it's probably best not to collect it. And then also how you process and store it. So examples of this, of storing data, like on Zoom, when you're working with clients, you should be things, you know, aware of, well, everyone can share the chat and see the chat, they can download it themselves. So what are the implications of that? You know, if there's any personal, if people mention personal data now, how are you going to kind of explain that, you know, should you maybe turn the chat function off? Things like that. Again, it's really important to think about what the experiences of the individual might have, and whether they're at risk of abuse or neglect. And if someone saw, for instance, them using it, what would be the implications of that? Have they access to confidential spaces when they're using online? So again, you know, we knew that we had confidential spaces when we were delivering things face to face, because we would book out a room, there would be kind of a one-to-one interaction. You could see and you could make judgments of what's going on around it. In a digital space, that's a lot harder. You know, we kind of see what's on the screen, but we don't know what's behind it. We don't know what's going on next door. So again, it's just kind of, how do you ask those questions? How do you make sure that they're in a confidential space when doing it? And again, it's looking at things like what appropriate safety planning looks like in a digital space. Well, if this happens, how would you do this? And again, it's very much like you would do it in face-to-face. It's just making sure that you're kind of doing it in the most appropriate way possible. So it might be something that you kind of have a conversation with someone over Zoom, but then it's followed up by emails, or it might be that actually text messages work better. So again, it's just thinking through all of those risks and kind of putting in any mitigation steps that can help you. So what we always say is the best way to do that is start with a policy. And you don't need to have a distinct digital safeguarding policy. It's just important that within your normal safeguarding policy and practices, that you think about how you integrate that digital within it. So what it should cover is what the shared understanding is, you know, why are you using these things, how are you using them, who has access to them, what the legislative framework and what your duties are, so around GDPR, around the CARE Act, all of that sort of stuff, where everyone can find the information. And again, that's really important for your both your clients and your staff. And then another thing that's really, really important is that there's clear leads and really clear understanding of where that responsibility lies. And again, the reason for that is also important that no one individual holds that risk. So again, with safeguarding, it's really, really important that you kind of manage those risks within an organization, so it's not held by one person, and there's a clear pathway to someone noticing something, and then there's an escalation process so that it's not being held with them. And I think that's really important. It's even more important the more and more with delivering remotely, because a lot of people will be quite isolated in that space. So again, it's making sure that they have a really clear mechanism that goes, okay, I've noticed something, I can tell someone, and then there's a process that go through, so they're not sitting there with holding that risk themselves and not knowing quite what to do. And again, lastly, we would always say that with any new policy, it's really important you get buy-in and that you train your staff on it, so everyone feels confident and has an opportunity to ask questions and go through all of that process. So, you know, if you're introducing, even if you're just adapting your safeguarding policy, it's worth having those conversations with your staff and making sure there's training available. So as I mentioned before, a key aspect of this is the pathways to when an incident happens. So as I said at the beginning, the top key thing is making sure there is a named lead for all staff. So, you know, whether you have different leads in different departments, that's fine, and there's an overarching one, depending on the size of organization, and also that lead also is a person that understands the referral mechanisms within the local authority as well. So kind of going through this diagram, as you see, an individual becomes aware of a safeguarding concern. So it might be something written on a forum, it might be an email they've got, they might have been doing a Zoom workshop and someone said something really inappropriate, disclosed something. Any of those things accompanies, you know, they've noticed a concern. The key for them next is to making sure that they record all the facts and all the concerns. And we always advise doing this, you know, in a notebook and a piece of paper, and not on kind of hardware, and I'll kind of go into the reasons why later. So the first thing that they have to do, like all forms of safeguarding, is to make sure that that individual is not not risk of significant harm. And if they are, it's really important that, you know, they're engaged with and they're encouraged to ring 999, and, you know, the staff are offered to do that on their behalf if that's appropriate, you know, all of that kind of. If it's not viewed in significant harm and it's an incident and it's, you know, there's time to kind of think about it, all of the information that they've recorded should be passed on to the safeguarding lead. And that's that kind of moving that risk to a different space. That lead or team, so it might be that you have a safeguarding lead that then has a conversation with another senior member of staff, and then they make a decision about what action to be taken. And I think it's really important to say that depending on the circumstances, that action may be very, very different. And it's really important that we kind of keep the concept of proportionality involved in this. So once that action is agreed, it will be implemented, and all the information and the rationale, so all of that kind of decision making should also be recorded within this process. So, you know, highly recommend having kind of a safeguarding log or something like that. We say it's best practice to feed back to the individual that raised the concerns forward, to tell them what happened, these are the course of action, is to explain them. So again, it kind of gives them confidence in the whole process and they know they have a bit of closure on. However, due to a variety of reasons, you know, confidentiality, that might not be possible to give them exactly what you've done. But again, a little bit of feedback, you know, thank you for raising that. It is now sitting with the safeguard lead, so you don't have to worry about anymore. And again, it's about making sure that you're sharing all of that risk. So the key thing, as we mentioned above, that safeguarding on companies of high, you know, a wide range of different incidences, and each one has to be looked at in its individual context. And so it's really important that you are transparent and accountable for all of it. So again, it's, you know, making sure that if they're using a particular device or hardware, they're asked to stop using that, so that can be stored as evidence. It's important that you don't delete anything, even if you don't think it's important, it might be. So it's just important that you don't delete anything and you record everything. Try not to avoid copying it, kind of keeping originals as much as possible. And as we said before, make sure that you write everything down. And then the next thing is that it's also, as it, you know, we were saying before, the response to safeguarding concerns will differ greatly depending on the circumstances. And so again, you need to look at each case individually, but that might also need to understand the context around that case. So the safeguarding lead might look at taking further inquiries. So that might be discussions with an adult or a child themselves to find out what's going on, why they said what they disclosed, what's worrying them. It might be having discussions with other professionals that are responsible for that child and adult, or that has contact with them. And I think the important thing is the idea is you're building up a detailed picture of the situation. And you should be able to do this through partnerships as well. So again, kind of meeting your local authority safeguarding leads, you know, that kind of multi-agency approach, so you understand what's going on and you're kind of sharing that information as much as legally possible. And then also very important is to think about, once you kind of go through that process, is also looking at any kind of prevention measures. So it might be something that's happened, you know, you've taken this course of action, but what could you put in place to mitigate that happening again and get it? So it's all a kind of very organic process that you look at everything in its individual way. So so we've kind of gone over the principles of doing it. We've looked at how you kind of assess those risks. And then here's some additional things that we said that you need to consider when looking at designing or adapting any services into an online space. So firstly, I would say is that we all know that people look for support online. It's becoming more and more popular. I mean, over the last year, we've been so reliant on it. So it's something that we can't ignore, and that we should sort of look at how we can mitigate those risks so that we can embrace it a bit more. I mean, in our latest survey, we had 63% of the participants say that they've looked for support online. However, there are some, and what they say about that is that actually majority of people, when they're looking for support, just Google it. And so that's also really important to think about how people access your information as well. So how do they end up on your website? How can they book in all of that kind of information? It's looking at those pathways as well from beforehand. So the first thing, so again, we kind of specialize in gender-based violence, but I would say that all of this is very, very relevant to any kind of work you do, especially if you work with kind of any vulnerable client group. And one of the things is that whilst, as we were sort of saying, that tech can be a really positive thing in people's lives and people do look for support in online spaces, it can be used as a tool for abuse and coercive control. So as Refuge pointed out, 3 out of 4 domestic abuse victims have been exposed to controlling, humiliating, monitoring behaviour by their former partners using technology. And so again, when you design things or kind of think about running groups or services, is thinking about what are the risks of that person, a perpetrator of any kind of abuse or neglect, how can they interact with that service and what are the risks and how do you mitigate them? So we always use the example, for instance, that we are building a progressive app called Breathing Space, which is designed for women survivors. And all the way through that process, at every single kind of page stage, we've gone, okay, what are the safety implications? And we do that sort of through co-production. But again, it's just kind of looking at that in that space. But this also means that a lot of people have a lot of fear around using tech, both in the case of the user themselves, but I think also a lot of professionals, because they've seen how it can be used to be a tool of abuse. So it sometimes feels like, well, actually, let's not use that because of the risks. And actually what we're saying here is there will always be risks regardless of what you do. It's about the mitigation of them. So as you can see, in our diagram here, that more than 50% of people that we surveyed said that tech was used within as part of the abuse. And a few examples of this would be looking at things like constantly checking their messages, putting, if they had a website or on their Facebook, putting kind of malicious things on it, blackmail, sharing images that they didn't want shared. And then you kind of go into the kind of other stage of it, which, hacking personal data, tracking people on apps, changing people's passwords so they don't know them, and then kind of monitoring things like that. And if you look into some of the stuff around the Internet of Things, it's really important to think about how, for instance, things like, you might have an Alexa, who has access to that? Are their password protected? How could that be used? So again, it's really just thinking about how these things could be used to help facilitate abuse. And it's really important to kind of keep that in the forefront when you're designing things or implementing them. So the next thing that is really important that you consider is that kind of equal access, both in terms of the usability of the product and or service, but also the content. So again, it's making sure that you have clear structures, that you're providing different options for people depending on their needs. And I think this is something that we're all probably quite bad at doing. If you look at kind of recent data coming out of the UN audit, 82% of websites don't have anything to support anyone with any form of, for instance, sight loss, and fail on kind of basic accessibility requirements on websites. So what we highly recommend is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it helps practical help for both developers and content creators on things to think about when you're creating these things. So especially looking at content, the use of images, how much text, what kind of, simple plain English, all of those things are really important, the size of text, but also then thinking about the usability. How easy is it to access? Is there lots of process to go through? So again, thinking about the kind of user journey. So how does someone enter it and how does someone enter and what do they need to do throughout this process? And what we would always say with all of this is the best way of doing this is user test everything with a diverse group. So, you know, if you've come up, oh, we want to run this workshop, go and talk to someone that has been part of your face-to-face one. You know, we were thinking this, what do you think? And they can feed back. Or if you're developing a new website or some new copy, you know, show it to one of your beneficiaries and say, what do you think? Is there anything we can change? And again, this doesn't have to be a huge laborious evaluation project. It is really about just sort of speaking to, you know, 3 to 5 people and just checking things that you haven't missed. So, as I said, some of the things that we're being told to us about some of the kind of issues with current tech solutions are very much that it's not free. The trolling aspect, I think, really does put people off. So again, that's really important when you're thinking about sort of message boards and how you use social media and how you would moderate that. A lot is around that there's a lot of information, but it's very generic, sorry. So you need to have it really specialized. So what are you doing? You know, targeting your group of users is really, really important. So you're getting information specialized for them. It's again, so it's one of the other things is that it can hard to find information if you're just Googling it. So again, what I was saying before about when you're kind of going through this process is thinking about how people access it. You know, have you looked at SAOs? Where are you advertising? You've got QR codes that you can give out to people so they don't have to go through the Google, all of that sort of stuff. People really don't like having ads when they're looking for information support. They find it really off-putting. And again, as I said at the beginning, you know, technology is not the golden bullet that will solve everything. It has its limitations and it has its place. And so it's really important that when you're kind of designing these things, you make sure that you're using it appropriately and that maybe you're using it to supplement a service or to kind of go along. So again, it's really important to kind of think about that. And then I think one key thing is that information overload that people get, having too much information at once. So it might feel like you want to give them all the information, but it's really hard for them to digest, especially in a digital space. So when you think about how you design websites or how you design training or anything like that, so that it can be digestible for them. And again, the best way to avoid making mistakes is through user testing. So one of the things I also want to talk about, and it's something that you really need to consider, is around responding to that disclosure if there's a disclosure online. So it can be very different to doing it in a face-to-face space. So if someone disclosed to you, normally you would have a conversation, you maybe take them out the room if they were doing group work, or if they've come in, you find a private space to have those conversations, try and work out what's going on. And that's not always possible in an online space. And it's actually about, sometimes it's about managing the person that receives that disclosure, ensuring them that they know how to manage the risk, that they've got a place to kind of check in afterwards, to talk it through with them. So one of the things we'd say is, you know, some of this can be done anonymously, and, you know, go back to that proportionality and how we store data, you know, there probably are ways that you could find out who that person was that posted something very worrying on your forum completely anonymously. But is it proportionate? Is it okay? Or is it that you just report it to the different mechanisms that there are online, you know, whether it's kind of Twitter or whether it's the data security thing. So you can report it, but you don't take any action because of that proportionality element. However, if you were doing, for instance, like group work over Zoom, making sure that you have a mechanism to maybe take that person out of the room, have breakout rooms, that you have another member of staff that can support you doing that. So it's not all on that one person, and that you can kind of hold those group dynamics. And as I said before, we always suggest having clear guidelines before entering any sort of spaces for them, so that they know what's expected, what content there will be, and what their conduct is. And I think it's important to think about, if there's a disclosure in group spaces, how the other participants might feel. So again, making sure you talk through it, everyone's comfortable about doing it. And the key thing is making sure that you follow all of your safeguarding procedures, and then allow all colleagues to have check-ins, both with the person that made the disclosure, but also with your staff member as well. So that, again, it's just making sure that you're collecting, you're transparent, you're providing people a chance to kind of process what's happened and what's going on, because it can be very traumatic hearing other people's stories or kind of what's happened to them. So it's kind of very important that you keep that in mind. Which nicely goes on to what we kind of talk about, secondary trauma and resilience. And in the pre-reading, we did discuss kind of the different forms of how it might manifest, so sort of burnout and things like that. But I think the really important thing here to consider is that over the last 12 months, you know, the pandemic has affected all of us in different ways, depending on our circumstances. And the actually working in an online space, especially if you're delivering online, kind of quite delicate face-to-face work or group work, that you might be taking on a lot of that kind of secondary trauma, working with vulnerable people. It often happens, you know, there's lots of effects of it. And I think the important thing is, one, noticing if it's happening and then taking the appropriate steps to tackle it. You know, ensuring that your staff have access to kind of wellbeing support, or, you know, frequent supervision so they can talk it through. And also, if it happens to you, to remember that it doesn't stop your ability to be able to provide the wonderful support that you do. It is just a natural and normal reaction to what you're going through and what you're seeing, hearing other people's stories, having to deal with that risk and that stress constantly. So again, kind of, it could manifest in kind of things where you don't have that you have sleepless nights, that you're having very unpleasant thoughts, all of that sort of stuff. You're exhausted all the time. And again, with all of this, it's about planning and talking about it through, making sure you've got the steps within your kind of risk assessments to go, okay, if this happens, these are the steps you take. And again, one of the things that we highly recommend to anyone is to have access to clinical supervision if you are providing kind of frontline support. So, and lastly, what I would say with all of this is what we kind of underpins all of this for us is kind of this trauma-informed approach. And as I said, it was within the pre-recordings, but kind of going through again, the kind of key aspects of that is involvement of your service units, that individual-led approach, and each person should have choice, feel collaborative in the decisions they're making, feel that they can trust people, that they get to have it safe, but also all of this profile helps empower them going forward. And this has to be on top of a kind of intersectional lens, being aware of how trauma manifests and what the signs are of it, and how kind of individuals react to it, and what the kind of best ways to respond to it. So, you know, each individual might respond to trauma in a different way, but it's completely normal, and kind of reassurance and all of that. And all of this is very much kind of embedded in all of this work. So that was a kind of round-stop tour of an introduction to digital safeguarding. So I'll welcome any questions that you might have. As I said, the Q&A function would be great. So I welcome your questions.
Thank you for the presentation. I'll just put the questions.
Thank you.
So one person has asked, what is a confidential space during a group space might be on the virtual session, or if they're sitting in a space where parents or adults or siblings can hear.
Yeah, so I think
say. So I guess the question is about how you are a confidential space. I don't know if Ava's frozen.
Hi, sorry, have I unfrozen?
I can hear you, Ava. I think Ellie, perhaps it's your connection. Did you get that, Ava?
Yes, I did. I'm reading it from the QID. So yeah, this can be a real challenge at the moment, and I think it's especially true that we all know that You know, some households might only have one piece of tech that they can use to access Zoom or video conferencing. So it can be a real challenge. And I would say that the best way of doing that is having conversations beforehand about what they're going to do to make sure it's a confidential space. Yeah, so again, and what that room looks like. So one of the things, for instance, we know that some people have done, and it makes them feel really comfortable, that if they're, you know, they don't want to be in the house because that's their kind of little safe space, and they don't want to talk about, as you say, personal feelings, let's say in their child's bedroom or in their study or in the kitchen where they can be. Some people have gone, well, actually, I'm going to go on a walk and do it. So they put their headphones in, they go on a walk, so they're out of that space, or they have access to a car, they go sit in the car with a cup of tea and have that conversation. So it's about doing that prep work and having that conversation with them and making them think about how they would feel in that circumstances before you do it. I hope that helps. So what we mean about resizable text on websites is around making sure that you've got the functionality within your website to zoom in and out. There are a lot of tools out there that can enable you to do it, because if you have, some people want very large text, some people find that very off-putting. So again, it's all about ensuring that they've got that flexibility built in. To make sure that anyone can access it regardless of, you know, if they've got any particular sight impediments, or even things like dyslexia and things like that can make a real difference to how people absorb information on their websites. And again, within the resource pack, there's some links to kind of websites that will help you do it. And I said there's lots and lots of resources out, different kind of programs that you can use to kind of set that up. So the last question is around offering kind of therapy and advocacy support to children and young people that have experienced sexual abuse, and the risks around the perpetrator getting the phone or device, and that it could be tampered with or monitored. And as I said, this is something that, you know, we get lots of reports about happening. And I think the best course of action is, again, finding a way to have that conversation before you go through the therapy and the advocacy. So, you know, is there a phone line that you can quickly give them a call and talk them through what their concerns and worries about? There's a lot of advice on the Women's Aid website about keeping safe online. And also, I would say the Susie Lampard Trust has some great resources around how to deal with kind of online stalking and checking, and how you can check that there's no kind of that have been downloaded into a phone that could be sending messages. So again, it's just about how you can't completely mitigate that risk, but again, it's about making sure you put as much measures in place to kind of reduce it as much as possible. So for instance, you know, having exit button, really simple exit buttons, have a code word if you're doing, you know, therapy, that if they say it, you just shut everything off straight away, and you know that that's what's happened, and then you have a way of checking in afterwards. So again, it's just building that all into how you go through the process. And we always say, it's like when you're doing safeguarding, you're thinking of worst case scenario. You know, hopefully that will never happen, but it's about thinking about that worst case scenario, and then trying to put measures in to prevent it or mitigate it if it does happen, and know what you would do if you do. Oh, sorry, I forgot to scroll down. I'll keep an eye.
I'm not sure if Ellie can still hear us, Ava, so I was just going to mention that we've got quite a few questions coming in, and perhaps you can pick a few and read them out when you're looking at them. But the full set, what we can do in follow-up is just provide some responses that we maybe won't get to in today's session. We can make sure that we do answer the full set of questions, but maybe we could take a few more, Ava, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'm just gonna go through them, and if there's some that are the same, I'll try and answer them one. So the next question was about sourcing external clinical supervision for staff. So there are lots of clinical supervisors out there. We AVA have a couple that we use as freelancers, and I'll make sure that some of the links to the association are sent out with the resource pack and the additional information. And as I said, you know, it's very much kind of there's a plethora out there, and you kind of we employ them on a freelance basis, which works quite well when you're dealing kind of internally with staff. And we say that it's best practice that you have different clinical supervisors for, you know, different management levels in your staff as well. So the next one is around you found a member of staff that's ideal in all aspects, but they're quite worried about not having the experience of delivering support using email and things like that. It's not important in the sense that, you know, if your clinical supervisor, which is assuming what the question was around, you know, how they deliver that support, again, is just really quite individualized. So it's having that conversation with staff. And if they're worried about doing it via email support, for instance, is giving him the opportunity to share what his concerns are with the staff as well, have that conversation beforehand so that you're all on the same page and so everyone feels comfortable. But I can't see, you know, it depends on the circumstances whether you know, how that support is delivered. So I think that's a really is one of the key questions, which is how do you safeguard ourselves when in a Zoom session in our private spaces? Now, this is a really hard one, and it's something I think we've all probably struggled with around. Everyone has started entering into your space. You know, even right now, you can see the back of my house in all that ways. And I think what you have to do is look at how you feel comfortable. So for instance, it might be that actually I don't want anyone seeing what my walls look like, and you can use filters or you can put a background on Zoom. That's completely appropriate to do it. Also making sure that after, for instance, you've got a Zoom session, that you give yourself time afterwards to debrief, have a check-in, remove yourself from that situation. Also making sure that you have, if you're delivering stuff, that you have contact with another member of staff if something goes wrong. So again, it's not sitting on all your shoulders. So it's just kind of going through it and making those slight adjustments that can make you feel more comfortable. And, you know, as I said before, you know, there are perfect valid reasons why people don't want their cameras on during Zoom calls. And I think, again, it's just being open and transparent. If there's a reason for that, you know, I'm really sorry. Unfortunately, you know, I've got my kids home today, and, you know, it's easier if I just do this without my camera on, for instance, could be a reason. And just being open and transparent about it. Okay, yeah, so it's following up, especially that you're entering their private space, which is, I think, what you were talking about, because you were talking about private tutors. So again, it's just making sure that you have everything, you have a process that you've written down. So, you know, with all these things is saying, before you go into the private session, what conduct do you expect from them? How is this going to go about? What things that, you know, you don't want to see, or where they are in their house, and all of those sort of things. And again, it's really good to do that before you start the session. So again, whether it's through email exchanges, a quick phone call, and set that up beforehand so that you all feel comfortable walking into that particular space. So facilitating co-designing workshops. So this is something that we carry out, and I know that there's probably some other sessions as part of Beyond that look at how you kind of do design and co-design. What I always say is what we've done, especially with children and young people, is have someone facilitate the co-design workshop, as in kind of content. So what you really want to do with that is start with some very basic assumptions and questions that you want to ask them what they would like to see. So for instance, in our tool, we were looking at designing a game to help people process their emotions and feelings. And what we did, we started out with kind of having conversations, quite open-ended conversations with the children, and say, you know, what kind of characters do you like in your games? Would you like a companion? So it's just kind of pulling out that information. You do that within a session, you bring it all together. And what we found is if you have one facilitator doing that work, but then you also have some additional support workers in the room, and their job is very much to keep an eye on the children, kind of perform that safeguarding well, and that has worked really, really well with us. We tend to do it in partnership with frontline organisations that might be running sessions anyway with those children, so they've got an existing relationship, so they've got those group dynamics kind of already bedded in, and they're used to kind of using video conferencing and things like that. So again, when we say partnership working can be really good when doing these sort of things and kind of broadening your scope. Oh. So one of the questions on how can I find out how secure different video conferencing softwares are, and how do you compare them and which works better? Now, first of all of this information should be in their terms and conditions. If it's not, then I would suggest they're not being open and transparent. So again, it's probably a good judgment to make. They're probably not as secure as some of the others that are very transparent about it. There are lots of websites out there that you can kind of do comparisons on what their different tools are. You can find, you know, if you look at, for instance, you know, if you put in Google, compare Zoom to Hangouts, Google Hangouts, it will give you its different functions, but it will also tell you something about its security. And again, it's things that you want to check out is where their servers are based, how they store their data, do they share it with any third parties? And then with video conferencing as well, it's very, one of the kind of the fears, I can remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was lots about, you know, anyone could join your Zoom call and it's not that secure. It's again, just putting in the mechanisms that, you know, is it password protected? Is there do you have the ability to make it password protected? Do you have like things like waiting rooms can be really good to make sure they're secure. So if you don't know anyone in them, you kind of exclude them from. So again, it's just about putting that planning in place and doing the research beforehand to kind of make those judgments on what works best for you, because they all have their own different pros and cons as we go through them. So it's very much just kind of working out what your needs are and that they fit the best system that you take on. So there was a question about sometimes we have people reaching out for our support with suicidal thoughts, especially over the weekend and at night and things like that. And then you have a system that automatically gives them some signposting information, and then you check in on them once you're in the office and putting the safeguarding. That sounds like a really good process that you've put in place, and again, you really kind of thought through managing that risk. I don't think there is a huge more you possibly could be doing. You know, again, it's just making sure that you clearly have those processes in place. The only kind of other thing, you know, depending on, as I said, I don't know the ins and outs of exactly how your system works, but if it was something that was quite that you felt comfortable with, you could have you could embed alerts into your system. So for instance, if someone was getting the safeguarding the signposting information, if they put that, so you have a system that goes, you posted this, you now get signpost to, you know, I'm assuming a 24-hour sort of the Samaritans or something like that, or the police. You have that, and then you can have an alert system that could alert a member of staff if that's suitable, but it might be not something that you know, for a variety of reasons you have, but it sounds like you're kind of doing everything correctly. So there are a lot of resources. So have any organisation compiled a list of commonly used digital tools and safeguarding implementation of those? It might be useful as a starting point for organisations to help them with their risk list. There are lots of resources out there. I said the resource pack, that's one freely available on our website, and will be circulated, has quite a lot of links and details about some of the platforms, and then kind of cites to other things. But I would also highly recommend that you look at the Catalyst website. It has a lot of resources there, and also kind of looking the safeguarding support, so that it's not a per se list of everything, but there are a lot of different tools out there. But I do like that idea, and it might something that we look into in the future. Okay, so when organising a session in partnership with a school, would you say asking where the safeguarding responsibilities, or would it depend, for example, on who's hosting the Zoom session, or who is? My advice on that is have that conversation before you have the session with that partner. So, for instance, when I was talking about doing co-development workshops, we were very, very clear to our partner organisation that we wanted the safeguarding risks to the children to sit with them, and it goes through their referral mechanisms. We check their referral mechanisms, but just making sure that you're all clear before you start. And I said, it really, it would really depend on the circumstances. It might be appropriate for you to hold the safeguarding words, but if it's in a school, it's probably most likely to sit with the school. The most important thing is that you know the mechanism to alert them to any issues. So there was a question about specific suggestions around safeguarding autistic adults on Zoom. I do not have any specific ones, but I will make a note on it and see if there's kind of any links that we could send you. So there's a question, I won't read it out word for word, but basically it's asking, and they run a platform that creates online communities and a space for them to meet digitally. The terms of use is that it's 13 over, but the service that they run have under 13-year-olds that would benefit from the space or gathering the sessions, and would they able to join on a parent's account? The answer to that question is, one, it depends on the circumstances, and two, yes, as long the parent can give, as long as they are the legal guardian of that child, parents can give consent for children to use digital tools and software. So they can log in for they can create an account themselves, and then they can pass that on to their child. So again, as long as that consent happens, and with the guardian in place, it should be fine. I think there's a follow-on question, which is about engaging young people in using games, and using the example of Fortnite, where the age restriction is 13 plus, but we all know that lots of children are there playing it, probably with their parental's permission, but and asking whether it'd be okay to engage with young people on these platforms as a practitioner. I would avoid doing that, would be my advice, just around the risks and that for yourself, because you don't know what circumstances that young person is on that website. And actually it's the responsibility of that website to do the age checks. It might be something that if you've had prior conversations, when you've had engagement with them before, it might be suitable, but as a kind of general rule, I wouldn't advise reaching out to people under 13 on sites that they shouldn't be there. I know that sounds, but it's just where the risks lie. I think I've got through all the questions.
I think you have, Ava. I want to take a really big breath for you. Thank you so much for the really informative and clear webinar today. So much expertise and knowledge, which I can see is greatly appreciated by everybody who's attended. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. I just wanted to share with everybody that there is a follow-up webinar to this, which is focusing on a step-by-step approach to digital safeguarding, which will be again delivered by AVA Project. And this has got a more practical focus and will introduce some of the tools that AVA Project have put together and used. I don't know if you wanted to say any more in terms of the context of that session, Ava?
Yeah, so I'd say it's very much sort of this session was very much kind of looking at the kind of frameworks and broader principles. Well, that will be kind of looking very much kind of the practical steps that you take to kind of do those risk assessments, design your policies, and looking at specific tools as well.
Thanks so much, Ava. I will put into the chat now the link to sign up to that. If you're interested, you can sign up right away. The other thing, just to remind you, is that I did share a post feedback form in the chat. If you are able to fill that in before you leave today's session, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, you will receive it as well as all of the follow-up that was discussed during today's session. We will share the recording. Ava spoke to a series of resources. We'll put all that into an email in follow-up. There was a couple of people on the call today which hadn't registered kind of via the route where we can collect your email address. So I've reached out to you individually, and if you would like to receive that follow-up, then please send me your details via email. Apologies, a couple of you mentioned that you didn't receive the pre-videos. They will have come from an email and beyond, and perhaps that went straight to your junk folder. So we'll include those videos as a follow-up as well. I think that's all to say. I think there was one final slide, which just has a couple of links in it. Just as a thank you, really, there are some links there to the resource pack from AVA and the DigiSafe guidance that they've put together. There's the Catalyst link, which Ava referred to, and a direct info at email for AVA. The other thing I was just going to mention is that AVA today touched on both data protection and a little bit on cybersecurity. So we are running 2 deep dive series, learning series in those areas, and you can find all the details to that and beyond. So if you feel like you need a little bit more guidance in those areas, then I recommend having a look at those trainings too. I think that's all that's left to say. Anything you wanted to add there, Ava or Ellie?
No, just thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you found the session useful.